Thank you, Professor Knapp. Please continue.
So, my Lord, could you please turn to page 16 now?
Yes. That's of the slides.
Of the slides, yes. So this is the second stage of the assessment process. The first stage is taking the 16 different criteria and then scaling all 20 drugs onto each of those. Now, it's obvious that not all of these 16 criteria will have the same importance. Some of them may, in some countries, have very little importance, like international damage. So the next step is to make a decision as to how important each of these criteria are in the overall decision-making about the harms of those 20 drugs. And that process is called weighting. And it, in essence, is done by deciding across the board which of those 16 harms is the most important. Which do we, as an expert group, care most about? What would the greatest value be in changing that parameter, that criterion? Which criterion is the most important? And the way we do that is by looking at each of them at the difference in harm between the most harmful and the least harmful substance, and how much do we care about that difference. So I'm going to give you an example because it's complicated. If you turn to the next slide, slide 17, please. So, and this is the one that's probably most relevant to South Africa, because this looks at weighting the harms to others, to society. It would generally be true that the harms of a drug to a user will be the same all around the world, with very few exceptions. What a drug does to someone's body is largely the same.
You're talking about physiological harm?
Yes, the impact of a drug on someone living in South Africa and someone living in Europe is almost always going to be the same. There are rare exceptions when there might be genetic variants. So, for instance, the Chinese have a particular vulnerability to alcohol. But by and large, drugs are independent. The effect of drugs on the person, the user, are independent of where the user lives. But weighting the harms to society is more relevant because societies are very different. And I'll illustrate that a little bit more in a minute. But this is how we do it. So what you see on this slide here are the 7 harms that drugs can do to other people. The harms of crime, environmental damage, family adversity, going across the top, international damage, economic cost, and community damage. So the way it works is the coordinator, Professor Phillips, asks the group, which of these do you think is the most important in the UK today? Which of these do you care most about? If we're trying to reduce the harms of drugs, which of these is the harm you most want to reduce? And they decided that it was economic costs, the economic burden, where alcohol, the huge economic burden, alcohol's at the top here. We know in the UK alcohol presents a burden of about £30 billion. So that's, I'm not going to convert it into rands in case I get it wrong. It's a lot of money. And the one at the bottom that they thought caused the least economic burden was mephedrone, which was hardly used. So if you go to the very bottom, the little rectangle at the bottom, you see economic cost is scored as 100. That is the most important scale. And then you can see how this group scored the other harms. So starting at the left, criminal harm, criminal action was considered quite important. The impact of drugs on crime was scored as 80, so that's 0.8 as important as economic costs. Environmental damage was only scored at 30. Family adversity scored highly, 70.
Could you give us some examples of our environmental damage, family adversities, etc.?
Yes, of course. So if you turn to page 166 in the bundle here, you see the definitions. So environmental damage, extent to which the use and production of a drug causes environmental damage locally, e.g. toxic waste from amphetamine factories, discarded needles. Now, that's of particular relevance in countries like the Netherlands, where the environmental damage, for instance, from crystal meth factories, has become substantial because people have mobile factories, and then when they finish using the chemicals, they just pour the stuff out the back of the car onto the motorway. So it creates an environmental damage. Another one, of course, you see here, discarded needles. Discarded needles are both very unsightly to the environment, but also they can infect children who pick them up. So that's environmental damage. Now, family adversity. The extent to which a drug causes family adversities, e.g. family breakdown, economic well-being, emotional well-being, future prospects of children, child neglect. And I don't need to give you examples of that, but we know in the UK alcohol is involved in over half of all cases of domestic violence, child sexual abuse, deprivation, etc. So we scored that high. We scored family adversity at 70 because of the huge impact of alcohol and other drugs like heroin on families. International damage. Now, international damage, the extent to which a drug that's used in the UK contributes to international damage. Deforestation, for instance, of the Amazon, destabilization of countries that are transit countries for cocaine, international crime, development of new markets. Now, we were rather uninterested in that. They thought in the UK situation that we reckon that only had 1/3 the impact on UK harm. We cared 1/3 about that as we cared about economic costs. And then community damage, the extent to which the use of a drug creates a decline in social cohesion, a decline in the reputation of the community. We scored that low also, 25. Now what happens then is that the scores of all the drugs on those scales other than economic, the full scale, they're shrunk by the ratio that particular criterion is scaled to in relation to economic costs. So everything is readjusted. And that's the weighting. We weight our opinions of the comparative harms. And this can be applied to any country. You could, in South Africa, simply take our data and you could reweight it. You could have an expert group and you could decide whether these weights were appropriate. When as I'll show you, we redid this exercise with 30 European experts a couple of years later, and they changed all the weightings. And they didn't weight economic cost highest, they weighted the likelihood of dying. But nevertheless, the results tended to come out the same. But the weighting is something which is relatively straightforward because it's about opinions rather than knowledge. How much you care about the impact of these different drugs on these different variables. If you turn to page 18, these show what are called the criteria weights. They show the proportion of the final decision on the overall harms of drugs contributed by, in descending order, economic cost. 12.8 of the total variance, or the total score rather, was economic cost. 11.5 was scored to physical or psychological injury. 10.2 to crime, 8.9 family adversity, etc., etc. So this tells you how the final scores are built up. Which factors contribute most to the final decision? Economic cost, injury, crime, family adversity are the top 4. And then, if we turn to page 19, you see a colour version of the graph as published in the Lancet. And this is colour-coded so that blue represents the harm to users, red the harm to others, and the total harm to the UK. So the size of each bar is an indication of its relative contribution. So let's look at a couple of examples here, shall we? Let's start with alcohol. That comes out, and I have to say that I was rather surprised by that. This, as you gathered, this is a very complicated process. You've got 20 drugs, you've got 16 criteria, and you've got 16 different weights. So there is no way anyone can game the system or estimate what's going to happen, because it's just too many variables. And alcohol came out on top, and understanding why alcohol came out on top is really the insight is given by the size of the red bar. The red bar is how much alcohol damages other people in the UK. And as I've mentioned, it's responsible for over half of domestic violence and child abuse, a huge economic cost, etc. And that's why alcohol is so high. Now, in countries, say Saudi Arabia, where they didn't drink alcohol, it's likely that alcohol would be much lower, because there would be less use and therefore less harm. And in fact, an example of that, if you go along, you see the 4th column along, methamphetamine. And there you have a tiny red bar. And that is because there's virtually no methamphetamine use in the UK. You see cannabis comes out having harm to others of about 8, alcohol harm to others of about 48. So it scales about a sixth of that of alcohol. The size of the blue bar is the expected harm to the user. So alcohol is not the most harmful drug to the user. Coming along, you see crack cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin. They're the most harmful drug to the user. But nevertheless, alcohol is more harmful to the user than, say, tobacco or cannabis. And then you can see all the drugs that are laid out there. And what is interesting is that there is actually no relationship between the harm scores on this scale and either our Drugs Act or the United Nations Conventions on Drugs. So, if you turn to the next graph, next slide, number 20, that paper has been massively cited. Our paper has been cited nearly 1,000 times, which tells you it is of great interest to the scientific community.
Which paper are you referring to?
The Lancet paper, the one with the blue, the one where the graph is shown on page 167.
167 of the trial bundle.
Yes, so that's where the original table is. And this paper, the Lancet paper, has been extremely heavily cited. But people have criticised it. People have said, well, that's just a group of UK experts, and maybe in different countries, different experts would come to a different answer. And that is a perfectly reasonable criticism, because this is the first time MCDA has ever been done in relation to drug harms, and it is possible that different countries' experts would have different opinions and different knowledge, and maybe drugs are different. And I'm almost certain in Saudi Arabia, alcohol would score lower because there's virtually no use. So how do we address that challenge? Well, the first thing we did was to replicate the study, and these data are on slide 20. We obtained a grant from the European Union. It was a grant that was awarded, interestingly, by the Department of Justice, because they had realized that they were facing major challenges with understanding the harms of drugs. They realized that European law on drugs was at least superficially not scientific. And they also realized they didn't have the proper processes for assessing the harms of new drugs. So they funded us to do a replication study. And we convened another conference, this time with 30 European drug experts, chosen by their countries, chosen as European experts, often to things like the United Nations Drugs Commission. 30 experts from 20 different countries. Countries such as Norway and Czech Republic, which have significantly higher problems with crystal meth, TIC, than we have in Britain. And this conference of experts met. It was a 2-day meeting. They reviewed the rankings on all the 16 criteria. They changed every ranking. They reviewed the weightings. They changed every rating. And as I've intimated, the Europeans ranked death more important than economic cost. But nevertheless, the final results, you can see, are almost identical. If you look at the graph on page 20 and the graph on page 19, it's almost impossible to tell them apart. Only one drug changed place, and that was GHB, and I think ketamine. And that tells us that this process is enormously robust. And certainly across Europe, it is giving you data that are completely applicable to the 20 or the 30 countries, including Norway, Switzerland, and Iceland. And if you turn to slide 21, this just shows the remarkable overlap of scores. And the correlation of scores between the UK experts and the European experts in statistical terms is 0.995, which for what you might call a social science experiment, where you have data collected by Delphic opinion rather than raw data, that is unheard of.
What is Delphic opinion?
Delphic opinion is the opinion of experts, where we don't, of course, because we have very little data on the absolute hard numbers relating to those parameters, as I explained earlier on. Experts are the nearest we have to the knowledge, and when two sets of experts agree like this, you can be almost certain that the results are correct. Now that does raise the question of whether South African experts would agree, and my own view is that it's very likely they would. I would be very pleased to work with your South African experts to repeat the process here. And I have, as I will come to in a minute, started to do that around one particular drug, which is tobacco. But I'll come to that in a minute, because I want to just, in the next few slides, do a more detailed comparison of the two drugs which I think are of most concern to this debate, and that's alcohol and cannabis. So if you turn now to slide 22, what I have done here is I've taken the data, the scores of harms, the ranking or the ratio of harms on the 9 harms to the user for two drugs, cannabis and alcohol. So you see them, the abbreviations I've used previously, ranging at the top, drug-specific mortality, down to loss of relationships. They're taken from the Lancet paper.
Will whoever has the cell phone on, please, will you all ensure that your cell phones are either on silent or switched off? They cause disruption in the court. Sorry, you may proceed.
Thank you. So, here you see the scores for cannabis and alcohol. And for mortality, cannabis 0, alcohol 50.
What does that signify, that drug-specific mortality for cannabis is 0?
That it is unheard of, or virtually unheard of, for anyone to die as a result of smoking or eating cannabis. Cannabis does not kill in overdose, whereas alcohol does. In the UK, 3 people a week die just of alcohol poisoning. They just drink more than they should and they drop dead. Drug-related mortality, the likelihood of continued use of cannabis leading to a death, we score at 20, whereas alcohol we scored at 60. Now remember, these are all ratios to heroin of 100. But you can see that cannabis is a third less likely to kill you if you use it repeatedly than alcohol. One of the reasons for that is that people tend not to use cannabis for as long of their life as they use alcohol. And there are a number of reasons for that. People lose the interest in using it, and also it's less, probably less addictive than alcohol. And then we have the others: drug-specific damage, drug-related damage. In fact, if you go down, you see that alcohol scores more highly than cannabis on every measure, with the exception of dependence. And there we scored it both at 30. To be honest, I think we were somewhat harsh on cannabis and somewhat soft on alcohol, because the evidence now suggests that cannabis causes dependence in probably about 9% of users, and alcohol probably in about 12%. But we scored them equal there. But overall, you can see that in terms of the harm to the user, cannabis is less harmful under our estimates, and I'm sure the European ones are very similar, than alcohol. The next question then is, what about harm to society? And this is shown on slide 23. And again, you can see going down the list that for all measures of social harm, alcohol scores more highly than cannabis. So it scores 2.5 times more highly on crime. What is remarkable in the UK is how much acquisitive crime is conducted under the influence of alcohol, and how much violent crime is alcohol related. Environmental damage, alcohol was the most highly scored drug in the UK, because so many of our city centres are no-go areas in weekends because there's so much public drunkenness and violence. Family adversity, alcohol far and away the most damaging drug to the spouse, the partner or the children of an alcoholic. International damage, they both score very low. Economic cost, we know the economic cost of alcohol in our country is £30 billion a year, way more than any other drug, in fact more than all the other drugs put together. And community damage, communities are most likely to be damaged by alcohol consumption, particularly public alcohol consumption. So altogether, turning to the next slide, which is the composite scores, and here you see that the alcohol score was a 1,085, totaling them all up, and the cannabis score 330. So our estimate is that overall cannabis is 3 times less harmful to the UK than alcohol. Now, I want to use the next few slides to address the question of, would South African experts come to similar conclusions? It's not been possible to do that with the full range of drugs, but an opportunity arose to look at different variants of the same drug, which is also a question of great importance in terms of decision making about drug regulation. And the example we have used is nicotine. Now, nicotine is the main active ingredient of tobacco, but nicotine can be delivered in many different ways. and currently there is a massive international debate as to whether new forms of nicotine delivery, particularly what we call vaping, electronic cigarettes or electronic nicotine delivery systems, should be made legal or illegal. And there is a remarkable battle going on in different countries. So in some countries like India and Malaysia, these new nicotine delivery systems have been made illegal, whereas in Britain they have been encouraged because they're a way of helping people stop smoking cigarettes. So a couple of years ago we convened an MCDA with an expert international panel, including Americans and Europeans, to ask the question, which forms, are there differences in harm from different forms of nicotine? And if you turn to page 26, you'll see the data from the computer screen that came from this study. And it shows very clearly that cigarettes are the most harmful form of nicotine delivery. They're the most harmful. The green bar is the harm to the user. They're the most harmful to the user, alongside the third green column, which are these small cigars that are only sold in America. They're cigarettes wrapped in tobacco leaf to avoid tax or to minimize tax, but they're the same as cigarettes. And cigarettes are also the most harmful drug because of the red bar, the harm to others. And one of the things I discovered in doing this analysis, I'm not an expert particularly on nicotine, but it turns out that half of all the fires in the world and half of all the people who die in house fires die because the fires are started by cigarette stubs that haven't been put out. Half of all the fires in the world, killing thousands of people a year. And of course there's also passive smoking, which contributes to harm to others. So cigarettes are the most harmful way of delivering nicotine because they set fire to tobacco. Vaping here, you see, we scored down at about 1/20th the harms of cigarettes. And this has now been used by Public Health England as a justification for promoting vaping as a harm reduction measure for cigarette smoking. And in fact, in one of our provinces, Wales, e-cigarettes are now available on the NHS to help people stop smoking because they have such important health benefits. So very recently, just 3 months ago, I came to Johannesburg and conducted the same analysis, but this time just using South African experts, no Europeans at all. And their results are shown on slide 27. This is a paper I'm in the process of writing up with the South African experts. So we reviewed the same different preparations, but we included a couple of extra ones. Electronic cigarettes that don't contain nicotine, and also a new kind of cigarette product which is called THP, which is tobacco heated products where you vaporize the nicotine rather than burn it. But you don't need to be concerned with that. What you need to see is that the results of the South African analysis are very largely consistent with the international analysis. They scored the social harms of cigarette smoking higher than we scored the red bar. In fact, they scored the social harms of most forms of nicotine higher. The red bars are bigger in this analysis than in the international one, but overall the results are virtually identical. And I share that with you to show that South African experts, at least in the field of nicotine products, are indistinguishable from European experts. So I would be very comfortable if South African experts were to redo the MCDA for other drugs. I'd have full confidence in their ability to do it and to come up with results which are largely similar to the ones that we produced.
On that point, if we look at If we go back to slide number 5.
Yes.
And we have there the 16 different harms that you list. Could you give us some indication of which, if any, of these harms could be meaningfully affected by differences based on South African socio-economic context?
Well, the harms to the users, if you use the same drug, the harm to the users will be the same, unless South Africans have a peculiar propensity to an adverse effect of a particular drug, then they would be the same. And I don't know of any evidence that suggests there are genetic variants in South Africans that would predispose them to a particularly adverse or offer protective effects to any particular drug. So I think the South African physiology is the same as the European, and those would be the same. In terms of harms to others, I think it's those 7 variables would be, again, I think almost certainly the same, provided the drugs are controlled in the same way. Because of course, some of the harms from crime are determined by the criminal sanctions that are applied. So, unless South Africa had a particularly different criminal approach to drugs, which I don't think it has, I can't really see how any of those scores would also be very different. What could change would be the weightings, and it may well be that South African experts would weight environmental damage or crime more highly than international damage or economic costs. So the weightings might change, as we saw when we did the nicotine analysis. The South African experts tended to weight harm to others slightly more highly than we weighted it in Europe. So the weightings might change, but I don't believe the actual rankings would change significantly.
Just to make sure that we understand what you're saying, what I'm interested in is you say the weightings might change, but the rankings are unlikely to change.
That's right. So I think it's very unlikely that any expert would change the ratio scales. I think it's very unlikely that South African experts, for example, would not say that heroin was the most likely drug to kill you when you first take it. I think the rankings of the relative harms are unlikely to change significantly. They might change a little bit, but our experience says because these are largely determined by the physiological response and the toxicological response of the body to the drug, they are very unlikely to change. So if the drug's the same, the body's response would tend to be the same. But it may be that people care more about certain things. It might be that in South Africa you cared more about family damage than the Europeans or the UK group. You might score family adversity more highly than economic damage. So the weightings might change, but the actual ranking of drugs is very unlikely to change, I think.
When the study was done in South Africa on nicotine, did the weightings change?
Yes, there was a slight change in weightings on the harm to society, which is why you see many of the tobacco products which we didn't weight as having any social harm in Europe were scored as having a little, not much, social harm in South Africa. The big one, of course, still being cigarettes, where the social harm was scored as higher in South Africa. And I think that was because the economic costs of smoking have a greater impact in communities where income is lower. So cigarettes take a greater proportion of the individual's disposable income here than in Europe.
Thank you, Professor Mata. I think you were on slide 27 when I diverted your attention.
Yes, so I've finished with that, unless you have any questions, my Lord.
Pardon?
Can I move on? Or we?
Yes.
The last few slides address something which is new and unpublished, and I'm I'm very pleased to have a chance to share it with you because it addresses perhaps the most fundamental question that anyone working in the field of drug policy has to address. It's easy to do what we've done up till now, in the sense we know what harms drugs do, we can give them to animals and to humans, and we can see how toxic they are. So we can make sensible estimates of harms, and we can even measure harms in society. But the real key question is, what are the best policy options to minimize those harms? And ever since I've been working in this field, which is over 20 years, we have always been asked this question. What are the best policy options? Are different policy options, do they have different benefits? Are they, can you make an estimate as to how best to develop policy? And of course, no one's ever done it because it's really difficult. Policies have developed ad hoc over the last several hundred years through government directives and international directives that have largely been, or at least removed from scientific inquiry. And a couple of years ago, we were approached by Norwegian researchers.
Who's the we you refer to?
Sorry, the we is my charity, Drug Science. Drug Science was approached by Norwegian researchers who had received a grant from the Norwegian Medical Research Council, or the Norwegian government, I believe, to address this topic. It's worth sharing with you the fact that Norway is going through the same process of re-evaluating its drug laws as is South Africa. It's doing it from a very different basis. It's doing it from a situation of enormous economic strength, the richest country in the world, but it's doing it because a significant number of lawmakers, academics and doctors are uncomfortable with the extreme prohibitionist approach that Norway has taken. They believe it's inequitable and it's a breach of human rights, the way in which Norwegian drug policies have imposed very heavy sanctions on people who use illegal drugs, but have been relatively lax on people who use drugs like alcohol and tobacco. So these Norwegian researchers, the leader is Ole Rogeberg. He's professor of economics at Oslo University. He is a world expert on the economics of drug control. And he and I wrote a grant, part of which was to try to develop a multi-criteria decision analysis approach to drug policy. And these are the results. It's taken us several years, and you'll understand why it's been so difficult as I go through it, because it's even more challenging than what we've done up till now. We use the same processes for the drug harms. It's always two separate conferences. The first conference, if we turn to page 29 now, I've already mentioned that it's a collaboration with Drug Science and this Norwegian Institute for Alcohol and Drug Research. The purpose is to develop an analytical framework for describing, measuring, assessing and discussing drug policy. And to do this, we convene two decision conferences. The first one, two-day conference, to determine what are the social consequences of drug policy. And the second, to look at different ways of regulating drugs and how those regulations might impact on the social policy outcomes for different drugs. Turned out to be exceptionally difficult, and we were only in the end able to do a full analysis of different policy options for 3 drugs: cannabis, alcohol and heroin. But the process itself has been extremely illuminating, and the outcomes I think you will find very relevant to the discussion here. So if you turn to slide 30, this is the value tree for different policies. So these are the variables we have to take into account when we are looking at what a drug policy does. And again, we use the process, the ground up, the bootstrap process we use for drug harms. We took our experts, and these were people, it was an international group, or at least it wasn't just UK, but there were obviously Norwegians, and there were Dutch experts with us as well, and New Zealand experts. And the first stage is to look at all the impacts that policy can have on a society. And it turns out there are a lot, but they can loosely be sequestered, rationalized into 7 separate dimensions, and they're here: health, social care, political, public, crime, economic, and the costs. And costs mean the costs of implementing the policy, because obviously implementing a policy of prohibition requires police and legislative costs, whereas implementing no policy on free for all sales involves no cost. So there are costs of any policy decision. And within those 7 impacts, there are multiple other variables. So there are 27 evaluation criteria. And that's a lot. And it means that's why we could only go through 3 drugs in the end. The next slide, slide 31, shows the definitions of each of those 27 variables. And I won't go through them all because it would be tedious, but the important point to note is that we're scoring here benefits. So when you see outputs, more is better for society. Previously, more was more harmful. Here we are looking at value to society. So you can see that, say, for the health cluster, there's a harm to user. To what extent a policy prevents harm to a user? Harms to others. To what extent would a policy prevent harms to third parties, such as transfer of bloodborne viruses like HIV? To what extent does a policy decrease consumption of more harmful substances? E.g., and this is a very relevant one to the UK today, because we have a massive problem where our prohibition of cannabis has led to the rise of so-called legal highs, which are synthetic cannabinoids, which are unregulated, much more potent variants of cannabis, almost undetectable and much more toxic. Another example of that would be alcohol prohibition in America, where it stopped the drinking of beer, but massively increased the drinking of hooch, or illegal spirits. To what extent does the policy encourage treatment? And to what extent does our criterion assure quality of products that are being used? Because as you all know, the big problem with illegal drugs is knowing what's in them. And even with cannabis, we in the UK are seeing contamination with other drugs, often more addictive drugs such as crystal and heroin. We're seeing contamination with organic material, and sometimes even with other toxic drugs. And then you can see, so those are the health outcomes. The social concerns relate to education. Does the drug law impede the medical use? This is a huge issue, as you will know, because you're discussing medical marijuana. To what extent does a policy impede research? I will argue later that current drug policy has been absolutely disastrous for drug research. It's the current drug laws, the current UN conventions on human rights are the most destructive laws to research in the history of humanity. To what extent does the policy maximize human rights and individual liberty to what extent does it not undermine social cohesion and not undermine family cohesion? These are very relevant to approaches which use incarceration, with communities being, or families and communities being destroyed by the incarceration of the breadwinner for relatively minor transgressions such as cannabis possession. The political wing or dimension relates to international development and security and the effect that industries have on governments. The public concern promotes well-being, protects children and young people, protects the vulnerable, promotes or respects cultural and religious values. The criminal cluster, to what extent does this policy not criminalise users, reduces acquisitive crime, reduces violent crime, prevents corporate crime, which is a huge issue, of course, in relation to the international drugs crime, which many people estimate as being second only to the oil trade, as the largest trade in the world, one which is completely ungoverned, untaxed, and is destabilising not only businesses but countries, and prevents a criminal industry. And then there are the economic benefits. To what extent does a policy generate state revenue? And to what extent does it reduce economic costs? Does it, for instance, save people's health? And then the costs of the introduction and the maintenance. So, 27 variables, each of which has to be assessed by experts. We don't have data on this for any policy, so it has to be done through best judgment. And then the question is, which policy options can we consider? And we looked at policy options. There are almost infinite number of policy options, because each of them can be graded. So you can have a free market, but you can have a free market for everyone, a free market for people over the age of 18, a free market for people over the age of 21, as the alcohol-free market in some countries is. You can have a decriminalised market, but you can decriminalise the amount of drug that's in possession. So the Dutch decriminalised market for cannabis allows 5 grams. It used to allow 15 grams. So there are almost infinite variations in the kinds of policy options. And in the end, we decided on these 4, which you see on slide 32. And these largely align with what modern current discussion around drugs, the terminology that uses. So the red bar at the top is strong prohibition.
Absolute prohibition.
Absolute prohibition. So the sale and distribution of the drug is illegal, and there are strong sanctions, such as criminalisation, or even in some countries execution. The purchase of the drug is illegal with strong sanctions. The volume for legal users, of course, is none, because the drug's illegal. Possession offences can lead to strong sanctions such as lifetime incarceration, and use will also be illegal. And this, of course, is an important variable. Some countries ban the use of drugs, others allow use but not possession. So that's the most extreme position you could take. And then at the bottom, the green, the free market's the opposite of that, the most liberal position you could take. That there is, for production, there is no restriction on companies or individuals. That means anyone could make their own alcohol, for instance, or brew their own heroin. Sale and distribution, there are no restrictions. You can sell it anywhere, not just in licensed premises. You can sell it in supermarkets. You can sell it on the streets. There are no restrictions on purchase. There's no restrictions on how much you can buy. There are no restrictions on anything, basically. That's an extreme position. I think there's almost no country in the world where that's an example. But I have to say, I think the South African alcohol market is not far removed from that, where you have very, very poor restrictions on illegal access to alcohol.
Could you expand on that? What do you mean by that?
Well, my understanding is that a very large proportion of alcohol sales in South Africa are unlicensed alcohol and refined alcohol, and they're sold to very young people. So that, I think the South African or the African alcohol market, the Sub-Saharan alcohol market in Africa is close to unrestricted, as any market is. But I can be corrected on that. But anyway, the point is that's the extreme, and that is something which obviously we're going to evaluate. We're going to find out whether that market does have advantages or disadvantages. And then moving up, we have state control, where the state controls production. That's an example, for instance, if we're looking at the Norwegian alcohol, the Swedish alcohol market, it's state controlled. The sale and distribution is controlled by state retailers. That's Norway and Sweden for alcohol. That's Uruguay for cannabis. Purchase, only adults. Age restrictions, either 18 or 21. Purchase volume, quotas. So as I said already, 5 grams take away cannabis in the Netherlands.
Just if you could elaborate, explain to us how those sorts of quotas are implemented.
So the quota implementation in relation to cannabis in the Netherlands is a point of sale. You buy from a cannabis shop, which is called a cannabis cafe, and you ask for what you want, but you're not allowed to buy more than 5 grams. In Uruguay, I believe, you're going to have a limit, I think, of 400 grams per year, and that's going to be done on some kind of registration system. So you will have a card, and they will stamp your card, and when you've reached that limit, you will have reached your amount per year.
And how is it policed?
Well, in the Netherlands, it's policed at the level of the coffee shop. If the coffee shop, someone comes out of a coffee shop with 20 grams and they're caught, the coffee shop will be closed down. So it's in no one's interest to sell to someone more than the state allows. Possession for personal use, the example of that is largely cannabis, where, for instance, many countries now allow the growth of plants, maybe 2 plants or 5 plants. And then the use, only in specific licensed venues or private homes. So that used to be the way we sold alcohol. In the UK, when I was a lad, alcohol was sold for use in, we called licensed premises, which were called bars and pubs. And it was very difficult to take alcohol home. You had to go to an off-license, which was an annex to the licensed premise, but like a pharmacy for alcohol, and you could take the alcohol home. One of the reasons we have such massively increased problems with alcohol in the UK is we disbanded that regulation 40 years ago, and we allowed sale in supermarkets and corner shops. We now have a 24/7 market in alcohol. So that's an example of how a market can be regulated. And similarly, the cannabis market in Spain relates to cannabis clubs. People go to the club, they smoke in the club or in their own home. They're not allowed to smoke anywhere else. And then the fourth one we considered was this one in pink, the illegal. Weak sanctions, de jure or de facto decriminalisation. For production, so you can make it, you can distribute it, you can purchase it, but there will be quotas, so that will be determined by the state whether a quota is a viable or a reasonable amount for a person to use, and obviously the threshold there relates to dealing. So I believe you have 150 grams for cannabis here. More than that is considered dealing. Countries have varying amounts. And that applies to all, pretty much every country has some kind of threshold below which people are assumed to be using for personal use and above which people are assumed to be dealing. Possession, again, decriminalisation of possession, that's the Portuguese model, where possession of any drug is never a crime, but it's still illegal. And in Portugal, if you're caught in possession of drugs such as cannabis or heroin, you are taken to a civil court or to a medical facility where you're assessed for dependency, and the reasons for your use are assessed, and then you can have civil sanctions. So you might have your driving license removed for a week, or you might receive a fine for being in possession of an illegal drug. But you do not get a criminal record. And then use, the same arguments. In fact, use is decriminalised alongside possession being decriminalised. So those are the 4 policy options. We looked at those. We bore those in mind. We then took a drug. We started with alcohol, and we looked at the impact of each of those policy options on those 27 benefits to society that are on slide 31. So we have to go through each of those and rank on this 100-point scale where each of those 4 policies fits. Which is the most beneficial for society, scores 100. Which is the least beneficial for society, scores lower than 100. And what the ratio is for each of them. So as you can imagine, that is a massive exercise. It takes about half a day to do one drug on all those 27 variables. Having done that, we then convened another meeting where we did alcohol again to make sure that what we had done was reproducible, and it was. We did that without any reference to the previous scoring, so it wasn't a carryover. We then did cannabis, and we then did heroin. And for the purposes of today, I want to show you the results for cannabis. So if you turn to slide 33. So this is a screenshot from the computer program that has taken the scores for those 4 separate policy options, and then has ranked them or stacked them according to our scores. So the colour coding is shown on the left-hand scale. Health impact at the top, followed by social impact, followed by political impact, public impact, impact on crime in blue, light blue, economic impact in green, and the costs of implementation and monitoring that policy in orange at the bottom. And so these are ranked according to that list: health, social, political. And remember, the higher the bar, the better for society. The greater the benefits to society. So you can see the highest bar is state control, followed by a free market, followed by decriminalisation, followed by absolute prohibition. And absolute prohibition does very, very much worse than any of the others, particularly than state control. State control, as I showed you in the previous slide, would be a situation where the state grows and supplies to licensed premises where the drug may be used, where small amounts may be taken home, where home growing in small amounts will be used, and where the possession of personal amounts will be legal. The reason state control does best, you can see, it's because the health impact is maximal. The health impact is large. is twice as large as free market, and I can briefly explain why that is. The free market is a policy which encourages use. It encourages sales. Free markets rely on maximizing sales for economic profit. And we know that free markets in alcohol lead to increased consumption of alcohol. We know that from the UK, where we went from state control in 1964 to a free market, and alcohol consumption has doubled in the intervening 30 years. We know that in Sweden and Norway, where state control, in an economic situation of similar economic situation to the UK, in fact somewhat better economically, they're richer, their state control leads to alcohol consumption which is half that of the UK. So we know that in alcohol, state control has a positive impact on regulating the health impact. And one presumes that that would be the same for cannabis. And then the social impacts are very similar for state control and the free market. The political impacts are... sorry.
When you say that the use of alcohol in the UK doubled when restrictions were lifted, when that word doubled, does it take into account population growth, more spending money for alcohol, for example? And that
Very good point, my lord. No, let me explain. Yes, so what I'm saying is that it didn't instantly double. What the data, the UK data show that from the mid-1960s, when an open market for alcohol was allowed, and the consumption of alcohol in 1964, the average consumption, if you take all the alcohol sold in Britain and divide by the number of people, the consumption, and then scale it according to the amount of absolute alcohol in what it was drunk, the amount of absolute alcohol was 5 litres a year per person. And now it is, it was 6 litres a year per person. And now it is about 12 litres a year per person. So over the intervening 35 years, there's been a progressive increase in consumption. And that has led to the fact that now alcohol is the leading cause of death in the UK in men under 50. And by the end of this decade, it will be the leading cause of death in women under the age of 50, because alcohol-related deaths have gone up enormously as a result of that increase in consumption.
Thank you.
If you keep comparing state control with the free market on slide 33, you see the free market does better for economic impact. A free market in cannabis would bring more money into the country, but that would be offset by the worse health outcomes and the worse social outcomes. And the economic... I've got that wrong. The impact on crime... Sorry, I apologise, I've read that wrongly. The public impact is greater for state control because there's less consumption. The economic impact is the blue one there. That is... the impact on crime, is the blue one. We believe there will be more crime in a free market because there would be smuggling and there would be economic crime around like that. And there'd also be a black market. And then the economic impact, we believe, slightly better for state control, largely because of the reduced health costs. If you look at decriminalisation, the decriminalisation is better than absolute prohibition, but it scores badly on public and political impact. It scores badly on social impact and badly on health impact. And the health impact is because of the problem of knowing what you're getting, the strength, the composition of the cannabis you're using. So this, I think, is the first detailed analysis of policies in relation to cannabis. And what's interesting about it is that we now have in the world all these policies underway. The free market is the cannabis policy in Colorado. The state control is the cannabis policy in Washington State, Holland, and Uruguay. Decriminalisation is the policy in Portugal. And absolute prohibition is the policy in the United Kingdom and many other countries. So one of the things we hope to be able to do is to, and we hope we won't do it, but others would do it because it's a massive task, is to begin to gather data according to these separate criteria and see whether our estimates are right and evaluate the outcome of policy changes using these separate criteria, because it's vital in the complexity of drug dependence that a decision isn't made simply on a single aspect, whether it's harm or whether it's economics or health. It has to be made in the round. And the sad truth is that the UN conventions, the British Drugs Act, Your Drugs Act, has never been based on a detailed, thorough investigation of all the important variables.
Yes, and then the next slide.
I thought it would be very interesting for comparison to share with you the data from our analysis on alcohol policy. There we do have more data. We have at least health data from countries that have absolute prohibition, and we have data from countries that have free markets and state control. And the interesting thing here is that, again, state control does better. It does best. It does better than free markets or this decriminalisation. And that is, if I can read it in this light, that the social impact of state control is higher than any of the other controls. And that's interesting, and that is because the state control of alcohol, as exhibited in Sweden and Norway, does some very interesting things to the market. State control there means that you can only buy strong alcohol, and there the states control alcohol of more than 3%. You can only buy strong beer, wine and spirits in government shops. Those governments are the biggest buyers of wine in the world. So they buy quality wine and they sell it at a relatively high price. So people are buying alcohol of top quality. That's the first health benefit. The second benefit is that the shops are only open between 9 and 5 on a Monday to Friday and 9 till, I think, 1 on a Saturday, which means that people have to plan their drinking. And that means it's very different from societies like mine in the UK, where you can drink at any time. You can order on the internet booze at 3 in the morning if you want to carry on drinking. So the regulated market makes people think about what they're doing. It makes people plan and therefore have a different relationship with the drug, which is in the end beneficial to them and to society.
That would depend on what we mean by regulated.
Well, their regulated market is it's a strict regulation.
Yes, that's why I say it depends on...
It depends. And in fact, of course, there are very many different forms of regulation. So many societies regulate alcohol through point of sale quality, but don't regulate according to time of sale. You know, bars are open all the time, 24/7, and other countries regulate quality and time of sale. And others don't regulate, they decriminalise. And this is the decriminalisation is this illegal selling of alcohol in your shabines and on your streets with these little containers of booze. So it's an interesting comparison. I think it shows that the process is valid and tractable, and it's hard, but I think it's necessary for experts to do to really judge the best way to develop policies or to evaluate policies. And that's the last slide.
All right. Could I take you then to the articles attached to your summary, the first of which is at page 164. Now, I don't want you, Professor Nutt, to retraverse matter which you've already dealt with. I would like you only to give explanation or expansion or substantiation when necessary. The document at page 164, firstly, could you tell us what it is?
So this is the article in the Lancet 2010, Drug Harms in the UK, a multi-criteria decision analysis.
And you are one of the authors of this document, if we look at the page.
Correct.
Who are the other authors?
Leslie King was one of the government's leading chemists. He actually co-wrote the government's legislation on drugs, including cannabinoids, and he resigned from the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs and his role as the government's leading chemistry expert when I was sacked. So he joined drug science as one of the many experts on drug science.
Lawrence Phillips?
Lawrence Phillips is the professor at LSE who is I would say, the world's leading expert on the multi-criteria decision analysis process.
And how is it that this document came to be? Who decided upon it? How was it funded?
So this document is the output of the first MCDA study we did. It was funded by the Medical Research Council in the UK, to some extent by the Home Office in the early analysis of drug harms, and by Drug Science. It came out as a result of a meeting of experts funded by Drug Science. Those experts comprised 5 or 6 of the government's experts who had, along with Leslie King, resigned from the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs as a result of their anger with the unscientific approach that was being taken. And we gathered together, we did the analysis as I described with the slides, and we produced a report which was then turned into this more traditional scientific paper.
And how was it received?
Well, it was received extremely well. It was, as I've said, it's been massively cited. It's become seen as the definitive article on the comparative harms of drugs. The graph has been redrawn many different ways with many different expressions of different directions of harm, and it's been turned into a whole different set of metrics. And it's now become the teaching paper on assessing drug harms in many graduate and postgraduate courses around the world.
Without retraversing what you've told us, you're familiar with the contents of this document. If you could just deal with any aspects in the document which expand upon what you've told us already.
Yes, so I think it might be interesting for you to turn to page 168. So one of the surprises of this research was how harmful alcohol was. As I said, no one, I think, had expected the results to be like this. So in this sense, it was a truly scientific experiment. We were using a new approach to 20 drugs, and we came up with a result which was rather, as I say, unexpected. Alcohol, the most harmful drug in the UK. So we had to look at in some depth at why that would be. And if you go to page 168, you see the scoring there for the different drugs on the two axes. Along the bottom, from left to right, is a harm to users, and on the vertical axis we have the harms to others. And alcohol sits right at the top there. And that is because it is the most harmful drug to other people in Britain, by some margin. It's not the most harmful drug to the user. If you look at the horizontal axis, crack cocaine scores 80, heroin 72, methamphetamine 68. It's still pretty harmful to the user. The average alcohol user will, many of them, about a quarter of all people who use alcohol regularly will die of it. But it's the harm to society. And that harm is so widespread, it permeates every aspect. So that is why alcohol sits there as the most harmful drug overall.
Tell us about what this table signifies in relation to cannabis.
So here you can see cannabis scores at about 25, that's harm to users, and about 15 as the harms to others. So harms to others, cannabis is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th or 6th in the harms to others, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 12 or 13th in the harms to the user.
And cannabis in relation to tobacco?
So cannabis is clearly less harmful than tobacco to the user. Tobacco scores at about 38, cannabis scores at about 20, 26, if I can see correctly. And that is because very few people die from using cannabis, whereas 80,000 people a year in Britain die prematurely from smoking tobacco. So it is much more likely to lead to death than cannabis.
And in relation to harm to others, cannabis relative to tobacco?
Cannabis is not dissimilar to tobacco in harms to others, scoring about 15 to 18. Those harms, I think, are somewhat different. The harms of tobacco to others are fire and passive smoking. The harms of cannabis to others come from the effects of intoxication, so road traffic accidents. I mean, tobacco has very little impact on driving, whereas cannabis can have some.
Explain to us the table at page 169.
So this table here, this shows you how much the overall score for each drug is made up from those 16 different criteria. So each of the criteria are color-coded, and that means you can compare across all these drugs. Like I did in the tables I showed you comparing cannabis and alcohol. You can do this for any drug and any other drug. So at the top, they're ranked according to their order in the decision tree. Drug-specific mortality at the top. You can see that contributes maybe 5% to the alcohol score. Let's come down. Let's look at alcohol, the left-hand column. Come down to the lilac color, which is injury. There you see this huge score of alcohol for injury. And then come down to the bottom, economic cost, the sort of yellowy, pinky color. Economic. That's the largest cost, the harm of alcohol, followed then by family adversity, and then loss, and then injury, etc. So you can compare any drug you like with any other drug on any of those different criteria of harm.
could just deal briefly with the references that are cited at page 170 of the article.
Yeah, so these represent the core publications on which there was evidence, or from which there was evidence that could be was used in the producing the Lancet MCDA.
What is your view on the credibility of these references?
Well, I think they're the best we had at the time. And they can, as you can see, they contain references from leading journals like the Lancet, Addiction, Human Psychopharmacology, the International Centre for Science and Drug Policy, the United Nations, etc. So we looked to find the best evidence we could. But of course, in many cases, there isn't quantitative data, and that's why you have to rely on this Delphic expert consensus process.
Hold on. So I have it, it's 1 minute, 2 minutes to 1. As discussed, my lord, by agreement between all the parties and with your lordship's leave, we would adjourn for the day at lunchtime.
Yes.
And then try and make up the time during the course of next week. But as I have it, my lord, we to start at 10 o'clock on Monday.
Yes. But for the benefit of those who may, in the public gallery, who are not aware of this, it has been arranged with council. Council, in fact, of all the parties approached me with the idea that we adjourn today at 1 o'clock and resume on Monday at 10, and in the course of the week make up for the time lost this afternoon. So the court will now adjourn until Monday.